Well, I'm going to jump into it, but, listening to Judith, and it made me think about something that my cousin, who was more like a brother growing up, used to say. And he's a plumber, very simple guy, and he chose that career because he wasn't interested in school. He liked working with his hands. And he said one day, he's very quiet, doesn't say much. And one day he just said out of the blue, people really love living near water and short commutes. and it just sounded, it was just this little profound statement. But given that, people feel very strongly about water, access to it, who gets to live near it, who gets to spend time near it, and all of you have different perspectives. And one thing I wanted to do was to get started by each of you talking for maybe about a minute and a half or so about your unique perspective and how that relates to either challenges in making decisions about waterfronts or particular considerations, and thinking about maybe the top one or two in your mind. So, Andrew, would you like to start?
Sure. It's been a fascinating morning so far, and really made me reflect on my 50-some odd, I won't say how many odd, years living in New York City, half basically in Manhattan, half in Brooklyn, half really with the city struggling, and I'd say the last 20, 25 years with the city really coming back strong, even though we still face major challenges. And so much of that coming back strong, I feel like, has been recapturing the waterfront for people, both for recreation, for housing, and also for jobs. And Tom did mention the Olympic bid that I worked on, and there's been a lot written about it, about how we won by losing, in part because we sped up the timeline on a lot of the planning around the waterfront, the rezoning of the Far West Side, the rezoning of the Brooklyn waterfront, the speeding up of some of the parks developments, things like the High Line that really brought people down to the water in new ways. I've been lucky enough over the last 15 years to work on two massive industrial repositionings, taking massive old industrial buildings that have really fallen into decay for 50 some odd years, where there used to be hundreds of thousands of jobs that had shrunk to fewer than 5,000, and started to bring them back to life for many of the innovation economy types of jobs that Judith was talking about, where companies really come together in this new era in which there is equipment and technologies like 3D printing where you can do things in very small spaces, which you used to need big spaces for, where young people want to make things again and they want to be in touch with each other. They don't actually all want to just be on their phones. They want to interact and create an ecosystem. They want to connect to local universities. And I think most importantly, a lot of those industries are creating the kinds of good-paying jobs with accessibility, and really bridging the inequity gap that we have in our city in many, many important ways, and we really need to focus on that. So I would say that is my primary interest and focus and concern going forward.
Boon Hui?
I think a lot of my work, especially with public art, has been a kind of reaction to what is happening now is, I think, increasingly there is a kind of real danger that, in many of the urban developments of the world, that as capital starts to concentrate, there will increasingly be very strong reactions from the population, and particularly the population who perceive that they are shut out. And danger signs usually come about. People get very worried, especially artists, when words like integrated development turn up, because it usually means a certain kind of development that does not include spaces for what you call public gathering and public convening. I think the thing with cities now is that there is a kind of desire among large segments of the population for places, there is a kind of thirst for places of convening, for places where people can come together in a kind of safe way that is, in a sense, not over-regulated, over-licensed to extinction, or because of real estate development, it's sort of shut out from them. I think increasingly this kind of closing of public spaces in any big development, that does not, in a sense, even from the process of developing that space, have a kind of attitude that, we want to welcome you in, there'll be a great reaction. I think that's what happened with, at least with the artists and cultural workers in places like Hong Kong, where the West Kowloon thing. I mean, the M+, initially, a lot of the reaction was very negative, because the feeling was that it was driven by ultimately a real estate kind of project. I mean, it was a project that was framed in that kind of way, and the entire artistic community, and you must remember also in the peculiar political context of Hong Kong, with its proximity and its kind of relationship to China, the idea that, that is something, this gigantic thing that is going to save you, but you are not, in a sense, part of the process of that, even if it's only perceived and not real, it is a very great fracture point. But I don't want to be doom and gloom. I think that's where I think planning can do a lot, and particularly city planning working together with the private sector and the NGO sector to deliberately inject, and you have to be deliberately inject civic spaces that are energized by culture that can be convening spaces. My favorite example is not from Asia. It's actually a place called the Les Songcat, the number 104 in Paris in the 19th arrondissement. It's a huge, I think it's like 300 over 1,000 square feet, a complex that used to be it was built in the 19th century. It used to be sort of the city funeral service provider, particularly for the less well-off of the city. But what it is it's been turned into a center that, in a sense, ostensibly is an art center, but the most unique thing about it is the public areas of the center, they put out, for example, deck chairs, lounges, and anyone can come and lounge on them. And because there are many youths who, in a sense, don't complete school sometimes, or they are or unemployed, they actually have spaces where young people can come, and the security only do one thing. They ensure that when you come, okay, you want to do your break dance, this is your space. And then somebody comes, they give you another space. There's no barriers. They don't parcel it out. All they do is ensure that whoever comes, you can just dance there. You can practice the dance. And what they say is, this is the first time all these youths from unemployed or youths who've not come out from the school system come there, and they don't fight, they coexist for, in that kind of space. That's just one kind of example, but I think it's possible, and such things increasingly, if we do not plan such things, there will be very strong reactions from populations of cities.
Interesting. Joanne?
So, from my experience with Brooklyn Bridge Park, which has stretched over 20 years, and the gestation of the park is actually 30. So for a public park, which you might think would not be controversial, I think listening to Judith and the other panelists here, what I would say is the most important issue is how it is decided as the waterfront becomes available, as the port has receded and the land has become available. How do you decide how to use it? There's a lot of different ideas, and there's a huge amount of competition and controversy. And how you decide who participates in that decision is a very complex issue. And it's not just true of Brooklyn Bridge Park, it's true of all of the available space on the waterfront now in New York City. And I think in a lot of ways I've actually written a book about this. I think Brooklyn Bridge Park is sort of microcosm of what is happening, not just everywhere in the city, but in a way, nationally, what is going on. And you talk about, people wanting a place to gather. Absolutely right. And the tension between, let's just say, economic development, where do we want to try to rebuild maritime in the city? Are jobs important? What role does economic development play in the motivation here? And what form does it take? In our case, it took the form of housing in very small percentage of the park, less than 10%, that is designed to generate the revenues to pay for the annual maintenance of the park, so that we don't have to go to the city or the state or whoever every year and try and raise money to take care of things in the park, which has not been a winning formulation in the past for public parks. And so we thought of it as a benefit to actually be able to have a revenue source that we could capture and not have it go to the treasury of the city. And a lot of people disagreed with that. A lot of people didn't want housing. Housing for who? And, rich people. Now we're having an argument about affordable housing. So it's been one controversy after another about how we use this space. Is it for the neighbors closest by? Is it for people who want to come from different places who don't have anywhere to go? From distant neighborhoods in Brooklyn, kids playing basketball who now are being challenged by the local people as disruptive, and maybe we should pull out the basketball courts and put in tennis courts. It's just that controversy and how you engage the public in that conversation and create a process that is fair and open and that brings diversity, so that the decisions that are ultimately made feel comfortable for everybody, to me, is the biggest issue.
Calvin?
Well, in direct response to your questions, the definition or the vision for waterfront. I guess one could say waterfront is an edge, and it defines the contours of any metropolis. But also, I think it's important to look at it not as a repository of other energies, but in fact, it is a border between the city and the water, and also beyond. And it's in the case of New York, of course, we're not in open. It's not it's like Hong Kong. It is not like Singapore on the other south side, where it's open to the South China Seas. There's a neighbor across the street, across the river. So the issue is really actually looking at the sociology and the geography of what does it mean by this boundary. And to recall the Professor Richard Sennett's definition of openness and closedness, open cities and closed cities, the issue of how to determine the difference between a boundary and a border. Boundary defines, as he said, this is mine, this is yours. This is the end of something. A border is owned by two adjoining forces. In this case, the water and the environment beyond, and us. And how do you negotiate that relationship? I think that's a most important insight that I always keep to mind when we look at what one should do. And so, then going back to the inspiration I got from the keynote speech, which is so overwhelming, so global, it sort of decreased my little concern to just one little facet, right? But one thing is true, I am definitely square in Jane Jacobs' camp, but while at the same time we understand that things don't always work so successfully from the ground up. We know in theory, if we can manage from ground up, from the cellular level, which is the civilians, which is our people. In the end, the city, what is a city? We talk about city this, city that. Cities evolved so much in the last century. And also, of course, addressing rural and urban. What is going on between rural and urban? And why are people decamping to the city? whole different conversation. But the fact of the matter is, the city is a place where we serve the people that inhabit it, but it is also our tool, our fuel, our instrument. So there's a kind of strange paradox where they are exploited for their function, and yet we want to serve it. And it's that conversation about who is it we serve and who do we exploit, or maybe that's too violent a word. How do we capitalize? How do we capitalize human resources at the same time serve the human aspiration? That conversation, that dialogue has always been a real challenge. And I've heard many things about culture, about social engagement, about mechanisms as in public-private collaboration. All that, in theory, are roadmaps. In practice is the challenge. So doom and gloom or optimistic, it has to be focused on how do we manage these resources so that we're all aligned, that our intentions are the same. The win-win situations. You make money and you do something good, but you make more money, and at the same time also looking at equitable solutions. Mm-hmm. Because quite often these win-wins are little, tiny, micro, and the side effect of winning in one area and losing in somewhere else. And to me, the thing that concerns me about this great city is with two mayors, we have actually taken something that needs attention and give it attention, and using public-private mechanisms to make it like something, but something is also taken away, the spontaneity. I've lived in the city for 35 years, and I remember Battery Park when it was just a sand pit, and Creative Time would come in and do these amazing installations. We talked about Williamsburg not long ago, 15 years ago, as being something vibrant where the citizens can actually have a voice. And now, in the interest of serving them, we took away their voice, so much of that voice. So how do you manage that? As they say, good intentions takes you to, sometimes, we don't want to go there. And that, to me, is what our role is. As an architect, there are architects like, Frank Lloyd Wright, a lot of them, or people like Mr. Engels at Big, which are visionaries and full of imagination. The question is, how do you manage imagination and make sure that it doesn't go into hubris, and at the same time look at the complex system of trying to broaden our engagement, to be inclusive without being overwhelmed by the bureaucracy or the kind of complexity in managing that. And as an architect, I think that is my main role. It's not just to envision a playground here or a museum there. Is to create the right canvas, prepare that canvas, so that other people can create something on it.
Absolutely.
Looking out to 2060 and the vision for the waterfront in New York, and I often think about these models that you see of what's going to happen to the shoreline potentially, and when thinking about development. But then also, this morning the topics around artificial intelligence and automation and the way people are going to be living and the way they're going to be working. What's needed? There's this thought that now the waterfront is idle. What should we do with it? I'm wondering, what some of you think in terms of the vision for the waterfront. What really should it be?
Well, I think in a lot of ways in New York, what we're trying to overcome, and I think a lot of other cities, both in the U.S. and abroad, are trying to overcome, is 100 years of planning and zoning that separated uses, that kept industrial away from residential. And I think both going to the micro, the Navy Yard, and now Industry City are examples where those uses haven't necessarily been brought together, because we have not brought residential in, but we've brought a broad range of commercial in and academic with residential relatively nearby, not in the properties, but relatively nearby. And at the Navy Yard, you see sort of the modern economy through the lens of Steiner Studios and the entertainment and media explosion, linked to Brooklyn College School of Cinema that's helping to integrate the workforce, which really suffers from a lack of diversity in the film and entertainment union. And you have that 50 feet from dry docks where barges and ships are getting repaired. Many of those barges, which will be used just a stone's throw from Industry City at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal to move more freight in and around the harbor for short sea shipping up and down the coast that gets trucks off of the highways and makes our city more resilient. That will help support the offshore wind industry that is about to take off of Long Island with 90,000 acres of water that will be developed for offshore wind. It's happening right now. And that can be serviced right across the street from Industry City, and the R&D can happen in our buildings. So I think those are just two small examples of where, to get people back to the waterfront, we need to reimagine being able to integrate all of these uses. The days of the 1950s and the smokestacks are gone. How do we reimagine what we can do with all of these different sectors merging together at the waterfront in a resilient way?
So I think there's no one answer to what your question is. What should we, what should we do? There's a lot of stuff we should do. I mean, in Andrew's case, there was existing infrastructure that's being reused. In our case, the port was gone. The Port Authority said it no longer needed the piers. And the question was what was going to happen to them. And initially the Port Authority wanted to sell them to developers for residential buildings. And the local community said, no way. And it went on for a very long time. That's why it took so long to develop this park. And the acceptance by the government of the idea of creating a park. First, they didn't have money. Second of all, it was too early. We weren't there as a city, there was no. The government couldn't conceive. I mean, first of all, there was started in the 70s and the 80s, and the city was almost bankrupt or was bankrupt. And so the idea of building a park, and also it also initiated from an idea of a local park, a park for the people next door who were pretty well off, and there wasn't much appetite for that either. But it took a long time to evolve to a point where we created a local development corporation. It was that community-based organization created by the borough president that actually did the master plan. So the community didn't agree. There were some people who wanted to bring maritime back, which wasn't feasible, but still, there were a lot of people who thought we should be doing that. So there was a lot of confusion about exactly what should happen. And it was only through a very broad community process that everyone came around the idea of A, park, and B, what they wanted to be in the park. And that was based on a lot of needs that being expressed by a lot of different people. But then it took really the Bloomberg administration to understand the value proposition of building this park. And it wasn't about, it wasn't just about a park. They saw it as an economic development engine. They saw it as a way to create places where the people they wanted to be in the city, to bring to the city, to stay in the city, what they would want to do, how they would enjoy things. And it was a quality of life issue that had economic implications. And then the people who were working on the park, Michael Van Valkenburg was the landscape architect. He very much got the idea of how to use the water. But that also came from the community. The first plan, everybody looked at it and said, this is not enough of a park about the water. This park could be anywhere. And that caused us to totally rethink what the park could be if it was more closely connected to the water.
How do you make the park more about the water?
You have kayaking. You have fishing. You have all sorts of. You take away the hard edges, so that you have the water can come in on it's called riprap, bouldered edges, which also happens to have tremendous benefits for resiliency. So when the storm surges come in, you're not hitting another hard surface which will break, but it rolls in and then it rolls back out. So we were underwater for Sandy, but the water came in and then it left, and we used sandy soil. We had drainage systems in place, and we washed everything down with water, real water, and it was everything survived. And now we've got 2 different buildings in the park, one with a system. 2 historic structures where there's a lot more flexibility, but one has a system where the gates come up, and another one has nothing, and it's built with plywood and all sorts of materials that can withstand the water, and it won't cost much to rebuild. So there's a lot of innovation in trying things out, but I think that our park, we have bridges over water. We removed the connections of the piers to the land so that we could have kayaks go by, and people have to cross over water all the time. They're very, very much aware. We have a whole picnic peninsula, which is freestanding with water on both sides of it. So the park changed, and that was in reaction to people who came and said, we're on the water, guys. Where's the water? And so, to me, these are difficult issues. I think the community can and must be involved, or else you're fighting them. And you can never then produce a place which they embrace. And we also have had democratic principles. So we tried to provide room for lots and lots of different uses that would appeal to lots and lots of different constituencies. There are playgrounds near the entrance, so people who live nearby and are taking little kids can go there. But there are soccer fields, which were desperately in need, and now they're being used practically 24 hours a day. There is a skate park, which a lot of people said they wanted. There are cultural things. There's public art. There's a lot of programming that's aimed at different constituencies. And so I think, if anything, the main issue has been about the housing and lack of acceptance, and that's partly driven by other development in Brooklyn and elsewhere. People are having a very bad reaction to overdevelopment, and that's creating a backlash everywhere, I think.
Well, I think this is a perfect lesson about learning to be patient, and that things are iterative, and that it has to be inclusive, and also at the same time, top-down, bottom-up synchronicity. I think you're just a perfect case study. And, you also gave me a good example of what I mean by dealing with the edge, the porous edge. And I would add that, it goes on over and above the porosity of the edge physically, and also the connectivity of use, like kayaking. But the thing that I think happened recently that I think of really greater benefits elsewhere are the ferry services that are going on, and it connects different neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
I think that is important. And again,
when we started, we put little boats there, but we never expected to have the kind of ferry service that we have today.
So great.
We also put in a marina, which we never expected to have either, and we got a Singaporean contractor to come in and build a fabulous marina, which also includes community boating and a school for learning how to sail. So those are things that could never have happened when we started, and we couldn't predict any of them. So,
well, the thing addressing what Andrew said about when you deal with projects, there's always a parcel. And the sensitivity to your context, even if you don't have everything under the sun in that project, is that if you can attach and make those dialogues, and the issue with housing whether you have it or not, I think at Brooklyn Bridge Park, you already have very vibrant communities. You probably, the lesson that was learned painfully is the High Line, that unexpectedly, a good intention of creating civic space led to some amount of commercial greed, which caused overdevelopment along it. By people who objected to it in the first place, which is ironic. And so this is where I think government civic mechanisms such as zoning and guidelines need to be put in place in order the civilians will feel safe that a good intention doesn't go south.
One thing that happened in Brooklyn, though, was when we had rezoning by the Bloomberg administration, the thought was that there was not enough commercial, large-scale commercial development sites left in Brooklyn around Metrotech, and there seemed to be demand, and they envisioned downtown Brooklyn as well as other places in the city, in the boroughs, as part of the Olympic bid. They envisioned development in the boroughs that they wanted to protect against businesses moving to New Jersey or Connecticut, have them move to the boroughs instead, to commercial centers. And that was the thought when the rezoning occurred. However, what happened was there's been not much commercial development at all. It's all been residential. And that's what's really freaked people out, is all this residential and big. Very tall.
Take slight issue with that.
Okay.
I actually think the most exciting commercial development and job creation happening in New York City right now is happening from Sunset Park to Long Island City. And you see it in place after place. Now, I will agree with you that there has been a tremendous focus on housing and affordable housing, as there should be. We have a real crisis in the city, homelessness at record levels, and I applaud the mayor for that focus. But you can have all the affordable housing in the world, and this really goes to your point, but if you don't have good paying jobs that move people up the economic ladder, what kind of city do you have? If you don't have a place where there can be affordable space for artists to bring the kind of dynamic ecosystem that frankly helps drive development, what kind of city are you going to have? And so, I think for some reason, and just going back to the education thing, vocational training became a bad word in this country. And you look at other developed countries, 40-50% of young people are getting some element of vocational training. I see somebody from the Harbor School right here. I mean, that's a great example of where we're doing it right here. But in the United States, it's less than 10% get access to vocational training. We need to rethink that and really engage. And I think the Waterfront is a perfect place to do it.
I think your point about, and the question about why people are moving to cities, I think the examples seem to be pointing very clearly that one principle that I think increasingly cities have to adopt, and it really is a kind of principle, is that people move to cities because of possibility. Because the cities are where, rules can be negotiated, things that you never thought possible, you could break it down, you could reinvent that. Then I think that principle has to be applied. That's why we talk about diversity, we talk about, in a sense, both a top-down and a bottom-up kind of approach. And that, unfortunately, is quite a challenge for quite a lot of developments. But I think we have to take that kind of approach quite seriously. Like each development, how can we create a kind of space where there is a kind of possibility of some randomness.
Exactly.
There must be. We don't know. It may come from the community. It may not. It may come from a technological thing. It may be, something to do with gardens. Like, for example, in Singapore, the rooftop gardens are now places where suddenly community building is done, because it's the place where all the housewives and retirees can meet suddenly. And it was never originally intended in that kind of way. The last point I wanted to make was about Andrew's point. I think there is a lot to be said, and you see this in some of the cities of Europe. I think it's very important as cities get very big, and especially if finance starts to dominate and real estate starts to dominate, that we try harder to bring small-scale economic activity, atelier type activity like we see in the north of Italy. You know, these kinds of flexible production housing, and it goes to vocational training. And I would say the US is not alone. Singapore has the exact same problem. In Singapore, we are very obsessed with how can we see the German system of education, where not just a kind of business or engineering education, but really vocational education. And because I think there is a lot to be said with trying to bring into the heart of cities or new developments these kinds of small-scale productive capacities.
Well, I think, you know, what we're alluding to, it was a very kind of elephant in the room, is a culture that's obsessed with wealth and success in the ultimate sense. And if you go to look at universities, what are the majors? You know, like tech, business, MBAs, but what can the whole wide world all be successful businessmen and tech moguls? And there's no sense of respect and integrity for vocational, okay? And I think there is a small little title. You can see people dropping out and become carpenters in upstate New York, small fraction. So I see a tiny tide turning. I think it's perception. And another is real estate. If public-private partnerships have to find some balance where maximum profit from terms of capital gain, return, you know, if you make a light industry, that piece of property is not going to be as valuable as, you know, luxury housing or whatever it is. And the negotiation of a city to navigate a situation where there's enough profit for the commercial sector, and yet at the same time creating a fabric of city that has that diversity, rather than just build whatever gives you the most profit. And I see the city turning that way, and it is greatest concern for me. We can talk about all of that, but until our government really comes down to the bargaining table with the private sector to say, look, how do we make it we all go away happy, is the challenge. I mean, we can do things once that's settled. You know, I think we can design the perfect open city that we want. But until that is settled, we are all minions serving those two lords.
Well, both of the projects that Andrew works on are essentially public projects, and Brooklyn Bridge Park is a public project. It was paid for. The construction was paid for by the city and the state. Now it's going to be self-financing. But, yeah, I mean, I think government has to take a stronger role in a lot of these things. You know, Bill de Blasio's requirement about the affordable housing units that have to be built in conjunction with market rate is the one that we're coming up against right now in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And it's not coming from the real estate developer. It's coming from the community. And their argument is that we were only going to build as much housing in the park as we actually needed to cover the maintenance. And that if we now are willing to do affordable housing, that means we don't need the money. And therefore, we should build less luxury housing, but we should not include affordable. So it's gotten turned on its head, where you have the real estate developer who's perfectly happy. We've come to terms with him on financing. We've been sued multiple times. We've redesigned the project. But still, it's the community, it's the Brooklyn Heights Association that's fighting and says, you know, we don't want affordable housing here, which is such a reasonable thing, I think, for the government to be requiring. And we've got a rich community that says, no, we want lower height. So I think these issues are complex.
Yeah, those issues are complex.
You know, Andrew, I remember back, you know, thinking about the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There were so many Brooklynites, I'm a former, who were hoping that there would be housing, particularly affordable housing there. What went into the decision to not include housing as part of that project?
Yeah, I mean, there were 70,000 people that came to work every day in the Brooklyn Navy Yard all the way through 1950, and that shrunk to fewer than 2,000 when I got there. And I think that the reason, and frankly the reason the fence is still up around the Navy Yard, although we tried to integrate during my time there with the surrounding communities, with some retail nodes, with an employment center, a visitor center, a historic center, but it goes back to this strong feeling, and some of it is nostalgia for bringing back, the days of the 1950s where everybody has a good-paying union manufacturing job. But I think it was a feeling that we needed to keep the Navy Yard sacrosanct for commercial, industrial, and for local job creation. And I think actually that has worked extremely well, and it's led to somewhat of a housing boom nearby, because people want to live near to where they're working, and there are all kinds of environmental upsides to that, taking pressure off of mass transit. And I think, one of the things that I was most proud of there was the connections we made to the NYCHA houses nearby, and finally connecting. Those were originally built mostly for the military to serve the workers, then, have become a place where some of the poorest people in New York City live that need the most economic opportunity. And we had an employment program there that 25% of all the people we were placing in jobs every year at the Navy Yard through our employment center came from the NYCHA houses. So anyway, the main purpose was to keep it about jobs, and there's strong community pressure down at Industry City, which, you're right, it is public-private in that it's such a big project, but it actually is 100% privately owned. And, the policy feeling down there is very similar. Keep this for job creation. We need the jobs local. We need to be able to walk to work, and we're gonna follow by that.
But it's interesting that that it's so shifted that the fight is to keep commercial, to keep the focus on jobs, and to not have any more residential development. We're not talking about affordable now. We're talking about the idea of saturating. Allowing private developers, which it's happened all along 4th Avenue. It's all over the place. It's not managed. It's just, buildings going up for residential development everywhere you look. And it makes people in Brooklyn feel very uncomfortable. They feel they're concerned about gentrification, very concerned, justifiably, especially when we're not getting the same level of affordable housing as we are getting this rampant residential development everywhere.
Well, being holistic, that's the thing. Everyone agrees in a vibrant city is complex. It's usually, you can have living, working,
right,
all in one place. And now we all have to fight for one cause at a time. So you end up, pre-marginalized, okay? So yes, we need industry. Yes, we need housing. But you work on housing, you look at industry. I'll go take a nap. So, where is that connectivity? Where can we have that dialogue so that we all just not doing our thing and trying to, how do we create better partnership?
One would hope the city government is responsible for that, city planning and the Economic Development Corporation. They're supposed to be figuring out ways, I think, to blend all of these needs, but it's hard.
Are there places around the world, outside of the United States or even in the United States, that are really good models for having this sort of blend where it works out the right way, that we can learn from for New York?
Well, I think Singapore is actually a pretty good example. You can
say. I don't think there's one. There are models. There are lessons to be learned from various places. I mean, in Singapore, you get both the terrible lesson of what not to do, as well as what to do. With what we call the areas that we call the ethnic districts, which are districts that are predominantly a single community, just like what New York used to have, but increasingly it's changing. Chinatown, and it's very strange, it's a majority city, but there actually was a Chinatown, was planned out of existence because it was given to it was developed according to tourist principles, and the one that killed it was to take trades off the street. That means the sidewalks. You empty out the sidewalks because they're very messy. The traders will pile all their goods there, and and the second thing was to take residential out because it became too expensive and unhygienic, so to speak. So that emptied the entire, in a sense, the entire precinct, you know. So where you see that not happening, we did learn from that. If you go to Little India, you will see all the goods piled on the sidewalk. You have to navigate this crowd. The traffic turns green and turns red. People are still crossing the road. But you get the sense that it's a living kind of community, and all the hip people want to go there, and all the great boutique hotels are in this very crazy kind of area where you can get run over by the cars, you know, because you don't know when you should cross the road, and that's very unusual for Singapore. But I would say the point is that different places have different models. Like there was, I think the keynote spoke about Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but I would do a pitch for what Sharjah, you know, the less known city is doing, because instead of building high rises and injecting, because what they are doing is using, for example, and they put a lot of money in an agency called the Sharjah Art Foundation, and they run the Sharjah Biennial. But the interesting thing is, what is this agency doing? It's not just about art. Every edition of the Sharjah Art Biennial is an opportunity for them to rehabilitate dilapidated structures of the building, and they are made for left for other users later. So it's very interesting that it's not the urban development sort of or economic development agency that is doing this. It's the Art Foundation, which of course in that kind of state is funded by the royal family. But every edition you discover more and more of the dilapidated old city is returned back to the city, because, you know, they keep rehabilitating it. So the point is that I think, again, going back, we must be very open, and we must try and keep open the possibility that because the issues are very complex, there are different kinds of answers. Or everything can be a solution. It's not just one. It's just which is the appropriate thing at that time, you know.
And then, of course, you know, your cities, we talk about cities being pretty similar, but if you look at a city like New York, which is very diverse, and then you say a city like Copenhagen, which is not diverse. And of course they can do a lot more because consensus is easier to achieve. And so therefore some of the conundrums that we're living with are less critical. I mean, and somehow the value system are very shared. So the government and the private sector both have a kind of a sense of pride about what their environment, their cities can be. Everyone has an investment in the city and consensus. But, you know, the downside is, you know, like if I go there, I feel like a tourist, and I never feel like you're at home there because they're not very embracive in a way. It's somewhat exclusionary. One thing we talked about, though, that I just want to highlight with nothing to do with what we're talking about is consumerism, and especially consumerism through kind of some sort of tourist entity. Because at some point you have to say, we welcome you to my city, but this is my city. And when the government or the private sector, you know, commercial sector start to pander to tourism alone, you create kind of nightmares, and also kind of you turn the city into an amusement park, and that's a killer, I think, for cities that entertain that.
So we'd like to take some questions from the audience right now. Does anyone have any questions for the panel?
There were your notes. I hope you
out there.
read them.
Anything out there? No?
Nothing.
Oh, come on. Okay, there you go.
Too difficult.
They just need more coffee.
It's that time.
You can stand up and say where you're from.
Okay. My name is Andrew Ryan, and I'm a student at Columbia University. This is sort of for everybody on the panel. And I was wondering what you guys were talking about, bringing in, trying to make more available those jobs that require maybe some higher education experience, but maybe not a college degree, things like plumbing and carpentry and that sort of thing. And I was just wondering, what sort of policy solutions or just solutions in general do you think that cities can be taking, the big cities, can be taking to bring in more people like that so that they may be able to live and work in these big dynamic cities and be a part of that?
I'll tackle that at the beginning, but I think really forcing, encouraging, corralling, high school and 2- and 4-year colleges to work with local industry so that there are those pathways that lead directly into the jobs is absolutely critical. Some of that is happening. There's something in Brooklyn we created about 10 years ago called the Brooklyn Tech Triangle that really links up CUNY City Tech and NYU Tandon with some of the developments like the Navy Yard and Domino Sugar redevelopment and Industry City where the jobs are being created, also in downtown Brooklyn. And I think there are those more sort of traditional kind of manufacturing or industrial service sectors, some of which you just mentioned, but I think and there will continue to be growth, but a lot of that is niche, and where the bigger growth is around entertainment and media and tech, and there is an opportunity for young people to get in those positions that don't necessarily have a 4-year or a graduate degree. But those connections need to start early on, and I think where government has really encouraged that, whether through internships or on-the-job training. I also think, we often hear in rezonings, especially around housing, how, developers are required to do this amount of affordable housing or whatever. I'd love to hear more situations where government is forcing developers to better connect to the local community on job placement and job training. And that's something we're already doing at Industry City because it's smart business for us. It's not just about community relations. If we can help our small companies, 200 of our 450 companies have fewer than 5 employees, very, very small, niche, high tech, entertainment, media, art. They don't have a human resources person. If we can help them find somebody local who can walk to work or take a bike ride or take one subway ride, that person is much more likely to stay in that job more than 6 months than somebody that's commuting more than an hour, say. And that's really good business from the landlord's point of view because that small company is going to grow and take more space. So there's a virtuous cycle here, I think, if you do it right.
It has to be a cooperation because without affordable, living conditions, and even the creation of jobs of that nature would make it very difficult for people to sustain, and the cost of living in New York too. Mm-hmm. How do you regulate that? We resigned from a real estate development project, whose name I would not mention, because it was a twin tower, and one was supposed to be affordable because they're obliged to do it. Mm-hmm. And we looked at the brief, the affordable program was so horrific, substandard corridors, underserved elevators. And then the affordable luxury housing has bowling alleys and I don't know, personal training spaces. And if that could persists in this town and it is allowed, that kind of development behavior is allowed, mm-hmm. I think, it will erode our sense of morality and a sense of what society are we living in.
Well, also, one thing that happens is that developers can sometimes satisfy their affordable housing obligation by building somewhere else. So the building that they want for affordable housing goes one place, and then the affordable housing piece goes in a low-income community or someplace that's much cheaper to obtain the land. And that's, also these are market issues. It's very difficult.
Well, that's a concession. I'm sure the government relented, which I think.
Yes, because developers say it's more expensive to build the affordable housing on.
Then it's not an equal conversation.
No, it is not.
Then they have the upper hand, and the issue is how do you maintain that balance?
Do we have time for just one more question over here?
everything I've heard this afternoon or this morning has my brain just going 4,000 RPMs because there's so many things I could touch on. I'm Jonathan Atkin, and I'm the president of Ship Shooter Media, and I have the enviable position of flying in my helicopter regularly over the entire port and get a perspective that many of us perhaps would love to have. And so I see all 526 miles of our coastline regularly. Couple quick points, just historically. Someone talked about how we want to develop pathways of commerce in terms of agriculture and growing agriculture and streams and networks. And just a reminder, that was what the Erie Canal was and built the city. It was a great model. As far as Joanne, I was the former deputy assistant director of the Brooklyn Children's Museum when the city was bankrupt, and we had the only capital funding in the city when police and fire, and we were being asked to be the generator of all economic employment in Brooklyn and Crown Heights.
Nice.
And as the PR director, I had to explain to multiple constituencies from Jamaica to Antigua that we could not employ everybody in Crown Heights, that we were a national institution.
But it's a wonderful institution, and it has a great history.
But we went through some of the same and similar issues, which so I feel for you. Paying it forward here, everything I've heard is sort of the view from the shore out, and as much as we need to have permeable, and I'd like to use that word rather than porous edges, I have heard nothing from the working waterfront. There are a couple of people here, such as Captain Tsao and others who work in the waterfront, and what you mean by bringing maritime back? No, you're not going to bring a 14,000 TEU ship that just came under the Bayonne Bridge last Thursday to Brooklyn. The banana boats in Brooklyn are gone. But there are other forms of maritime. We've had 16 years since World Trade Center when we had calling all boats and the evacuation of people, and we still don't have adequate access to the edge. It is still a boundary. It is still a border. And that's a simple fix. That's very small. There's 3 million zillion problems, but that's a simple fix. There have been people who have tried as pioneers in this city, such as John Crevy with the Frying Pan Pier, who predated everyone in the concept of making a multi-use pier for everyone and everything from tugboats to restaurants to recreational boating. I've not seen that concept embraced, perhaps at Brooklyn Bridge Park, but his concept was huge. I mean, he also championed rust, which is not something that necessarily is acceptable by the EDC. But the point is that there have been precedents, but oftentimes regulatory issues, which I'm sure all of you are more familiar than I, in thwarting some of these issues and these visionaries. And that is an issue of how do we create that collaborative sense of urgency, which is what I think some of this is about, but also to focus that there is a view from the water in as opposed only from the shore out.
Yes.
I think there's a little bit of stay tuned for the next panel on that too, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank the panel for a lively and interesting discussion. And a discussion that went in directions that I wasn't even expecting.
Can I just say one thing? I just want to make a little plug. Joanne, please don't take the basketball courts away from Brooklyn Bridge Park,
we're
okay?
not going to.
As a person who still thinks he can play that game, I like to have those kids there.
Well, please come.
And thank you all. Really appreciate it. Yeah.